Hello, I'm Professor Philip Clark from the Centre for Health Policy at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health. The purpose of today's lecture is to look at what is economics, to give you a background in economics and economic evaluation that forms part of our one-day short course into economic evaluation, to give you an idea of the sorts of issues which will be covered in the course. So in terms of the lecture, we'll start off with a series of diagrams showing various trends concerning health, both in terms of health outcomes and in costs, which will come under a section called Food for Thought. Then we'll look at what is economics and what are the fundamental questions economists are concerned with. Then finally we'll look at types of economic evaluation and develop a taxonomy you can work through to work out what are the best ways to evaluate a health intervention. If we start in terms of health outcomes, probably the most important is always life expectancy, which, as you can see in the attached figure, has increased quite considerably over the last century. In Australia, in 1890, a person who was born in Australia at that time could expect to live to around about 50 years of age. At the end of the 20th century, in around the year 2000, they could expect to live near 80 years of age. So there was a 30-year increase in life expectancy over the course of the 20th century. At the age of 65, similarly, someone could live in 1890 to close to around 76, 77 years, and by the end of that century, well over 80 years. But as you can see from this diagram, although there are trends, it's perhaps hard to distinguish exactly when and how they're occurring. So one thing economists often do is look at marginal or incremental change. So basically one can look at the change from one period to another in terms of the life expectancies at various points, which, as you can see, start in 1890, but then basically every decade we get an updated estimate of life expectancy for the Australian population. So in this figure here, what we've done is just basically taken those increments, and as you can see early on, the life expectancy at birth was increasing by over 3 to 4 years each decade, which has given the elimination of childhood diseases and diseases early in life. Basically, there were very rapid increases in life expectancy. If we compare that with the increases in life expectancy for those over the age of 65, there was less than half a year to a year up until the 1960s. Interestingly, by the sort of 1960s, the growth in life expectancy had fallen away, and there was a considerable debate at that time as to whether we had reached our sort of a natural limit in life expectancy. But then kind of a very interesting trend occurred, which is that there were increases in life expectancy, but they were mainly occurring in the upper age groups. So as you can see here, these trends in this period here were occurring, that the life expectancy was increasing actually mainly in those over the age of 65, where each decade people's life expectancy at the age of 65 was increasing by around about a year or more. And that trend has continued to today, which obviously then has big consequences for society, as not only are we getting an ageing of the Australian society, like many other developed countries, but also those older people are living longer. And that's obviously a very important trend that's obviously having enormous benefits in terms of people. Their life expectancy is considerably increasing, but it does mean that there are substantial healthcare costs towards the end of life, which are probably associated with these increases in health outcomes. So if we go to the next graph here, which is the, I suppose, flip side, which is the trends in costs, and what we're focusing on here is changes in pharmaceutical expenditure, which is one important part of overall healthcare costs. And we can basically get the overall total health expenditure through the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, or PBS, back to the 1940s when the scheme was first created. And again, you see some quite interesting trends. What we've done here is manipulated the cost series to take out any sort of effects of inflation. So these are calculated or deflated for the effects of inflation over time. So we're basically expressing these in what economists would call in real terms. So the scheme, as you can see, in this period started where there was a growing trend in the use of pharmaceuticals and an increasing number going on to the scheme, and effectively the scheme grew to around $2 billion in real terms in the early 1970s. The 1970s was a period where there was high inflation, so actually in real terms, although the scheme may have been growing in nominal terms, inflation was very quickly, meaning that the scheme in real terms was held in pretty much at a constant rate or constant expenditure of about $2 billion over the next 20 years until about 1990. And then at that stage, there was a very large increase in the scheme where we're now spending around about $10 billion per year on pharmaceuticals. That was largely associated with a very great expansion in the use of drugs to treat chronic conditions such as cardiovascular disease. So if basically this next slide shows you exactly the same series, but what we have done is divided through the overall expenditure by the gross domestic product, which is the overall level of spending in the economy. And as you can see, what it shows is that there has been a continuous and over some periods an expanding proportion of money of the overall GDP is being spent on pharmaceuticals. Interestingly, about 10 years ago, the Australian government, through the Commonwealth Treasury, commissioned the first, what was called the Intergenerational Report, which was looking at long-term trends in expenditure. And as you can see, they were very concerned that with the rapidly rising rate of pharmaceutical expenditure, which to some degree has actually perhaps ameliorated since that time, but it is still on an upward trend. And so clearly this has important long-term implications for government because we're spending more and more on healthcare over time. In the next slide, which is taken from a recent report called the McKeon Review into Health and Medical Research in Australia, and this in turn is based on a recent updated intergenerational report from 2010 produced by the Commonwealth Treasury. What this shows is Treasury projections of health expenditure over time from current times out to the year 2050. And as you can see, there's perhaps two effects that may affect the long-term trend in health expenditure. One is the effect of the ageing of the population, which in real terms, the expenditure can perhaps be expected to go from around 51 billion to 129 billion, so it will more than double. But on top of that, there's an increasing demand for the higher standard of care. So not only can we expect healthcare to rise because there are more older people who demand more healthcare, but those people in turn are likely to increase their use of healthcare over time compared with people at current levels. And again, that may end up adding an additional they estimate 128 billion. And if that's the case, then there will be very, very large increases in the proportion of money devoted to health expenditure in Australia over time. So again, reinforcing that there are real choices to be made by the Australian community about how much we spend on healthcare relative to other goods. So in the next slide, what we do is what we're comparing, and this is again a commonly quoted or a figure, in this case from the Atlas of Global Inequality. And what this basically maps out is the life expectancy on the y-axis versus per capita healthcare spending, which has been adjusted into international dollars to take into account different price levels in different countries. And what you can see here is basically there is perhaps a clear association between these two, between per capita expenditure and life expectancy, where countries with relatively low life expectancy, as it were, also generally have low per capita expenditure. As per capita expenditure is higher, there tends to be fairly rapid increases in life expectancy, although we're not suggesting this is necessarily caused by the increase in health expenditure. But what appears to happen is expenditure appears as expenditure appears to increase, there isn't sort of a linear relationship between life expectancy, but there tends to be a flattening out. And as one can see, we've identified a series of countries, including Australia and Japan and Switzerland and the United States, is that often basically these countries have a very similar sort of life expectancy, but some of these countries have much higher per capita healthcare expenditure. So effectively what that's sort of perhaps saying is that as over time, or people tend to spend more on health, but perhaps the margin is involved in terms of the amount of extra life expectancy you'll get for that expenditure is perhaps decreasing over time. And again, perhaps if we this is perhaps reinforced in the next diagram, which again is from the McKeon review mentioned earlier. And what this suggests here is very much the way an economist would think about spending, is that you potentially could rank healthcare programs in terms of the degree to which they increase health outcomes. And people commonly regard public health interventions, often things like vaccinations, as having very high gains with them in terms of producing high increases in life expectancy or quality adjusted life years. And then there's perhaps an intermediate set of interventions such as open heart surgery and renal dialysis, where you are increasing expenditure but you've got increasing gains. Then interestingly, potentially there's one might call a flat part of the curve, where one might be increasing expenditure but actually not getting any potential increases in quality adjusted life years. And potentially one may get, if you've got things like adverse drug reactions and potentially complications of interventions such as complications of surgery, you might get something where you're spending more but actually have got lower outcomes. Clearly, then potentially one should be looking to rank these and basically looking at trying to sort out interventions which are giving you increasing outcomes for additional expenditure. So what's economics? Well, I think we've hopefully introduced some of the economic or questions economists are confronted with in the first few slides, but economics is concerned with the allocation of scarce resources. Resources at any point in time are broadly fixed, and therefore choices have to be made concerning whether we, both at an individual level, whether, for example, we spend more on housing or more on cars or more on our healthcare, and of course at a societal level as to whether we should spend more on healthcare or have tax cuts or spend more on other forms of expenditure. So I think one of the very famous economists of the 20th century was John Maynard Keynes, and as you can see, this quote here is very much saying economics is a branch of logic, a way of thinking. The theory of economics does not furnish a body of settled conclusions immediately applicable to policy. It is a method rather than a doctrine, an apparatus of the mind, a technique of thinking. So basically what Keynes is indicating is that economists, I think, may not all agree when they analyse a problem, but they should have a framework where we can understand why they disagree, and generally that will be due to some of the assumptions they make in the way they're analysing a problem. So economics, as I said, is clearly there are differences between economists in terms of if two economists undertook the same evaluation exercise, they may come to different conclusions, but we should be able to understand why that is the case. So what is economic evaluation? It's clearly just a subset of the general economic problem. In this case, we're trying to look at scarce healthcare resources. We want to maximise the gain, health gain with available resources. I think crucially what we want to do is compare cost and effectiveness of therapies. So we want to balance costs and effects. And to perhaps match up with the previous slide, we want explicit criteria for making choices. So the third part of this lecture is I will focus on this schematic diagram as a way to try and determine what sort of economic evaluation or technique of economic evaluation is most appropriate. One should start at the top And as you can see, if we start at the top box up here with the first question, one should basically be asking, is there good evidence on the effectiveness of the intervention being compared? If we come down here to no, really what we're limited to is a costing study. So I'll talk about that first. So when it comes to a costing study, these have been done, as I'll show in a minute, for more than a century. What basically one is trying to do is quantify the burden of a disease, including the lost productivity, healthcare costs, potentially broader impacts on society. These are often used in an advocacy form for people to highlight the burden of a disease, but they basically tell us about the size of the problem, not what people should do about it. I think economists, often health economists, perhaps potentially see this as a starting point, certainly not a final analysis. And perhaps often these analyses are fairly partial, and they rarely provide perhaps a context with which to judge how costly it is in relation to overall expenditure. And I'll show you that in a minute. So perhaps taking a leaf again out of history, as you can see, this is from a book from 1906 by Huber about tuberculosis, and one of the chapters is about the cost of tuberculosis. And interestingly here, I'll just read the quote out, tuberculosis causes annually more than 150,000 deaths in the United States. If we assume the net value of a year of human life is at least $50, the real loss to the nation may be estimated at $240 million per annum. These astounding and almost incomprehensible figures are far from being an exaggeration. So clearly what Huber was trying to do was show that tuberculosis put an enormous burden on the society in the United States at that time. What is perhaps interesting is the value of human life at $50, even if we translate that roughly into today's dollars, which would be just over $1,200, that they do seem low compared to the sort of values we talk about, and also our overall level of healthcare expenditure clearly exceeds what it was in 1906. So if we go forward a century, as you can see, this quote is a similar sort of quote, except instead of talking about tuberculosis, this is by Barack Obama from his healthcare plan in 2008. What he's talking about is diabetes. The millions have been turned into billions, and again, people are talking about the enormous costs of chronic disease. So it's a good starting point, but it really doesn't tell us how we should tackle these diseases and what is the cost-effective strategies which we'll need to move to next. So just to provide an Australian example, here's a cost of illness study to do with foodborne illness. What we've got here is, as you can see, it breaks it down into initially productivity and lifestyle. So that's basically foodborne illness, its effects on people's ability to work. There's premature mortality. There's the use of healthcare services, which is around about 200 million. So in total, there's basically around about 1.2 billion, but that's largely due to what people call the productivity losses, or the effects it has on people's ability to work, rather than the direct healthcare costs themselves. But to put that into some context, that would be less than 1% of GDP, and it's about 0.2% of healthcare spending. So I suppose 1.2 billion sounds like a large number, but if you put it in context, then the question is whether that's really, or how much of a burden that is to the overall expenditure or overall healthcare spending. So if we move back to our diagram, what we want to do is go to the next level, which is the effectiveness of the interventions equal? If that's the case, yes, we could use potentially a cost minimisation study. If it's no, what we want to do is potentially use either cost-benefit or cost-effectiveness analysis. So cost minimisation analysis, which is basically should only occur if we know the two interventions are equal. And I think what's very important here is what we shouldn't be applying cost minimisation to is when we basically don't have the statistical power to detect a difference. So it's always a fallacy to say if you can't detect a difference between two outcomes to assume that they are equal. I think the modern view very much is that cost effectiveness analysis is far preferable to cost minimisation analysis, unless you've got special cases where you have an identical outcome and then you're just looking at two processes that cost different amounts or two interventions that will produce that identical outcome. So I won't talk very much further about cost minimisation analysis. So perhaps the next part of in this schematic is looking at whether the outcomes can be valued in monetary terms. If that case is yes, we should use cost-benefit analysis. And I think, importantly, for an economist, cost-benefit analysis has a very specific meaning. It means that you value costs and benefits using dollars. So the advantage of cost-benefit analysis is that you can compare across different sectors. So, for example, if you do a cost-benefit analysis in transport or telecommunications, you can potentially compare those policies versus health policies. And it also addresses the net gains to society. So it provides an absolute answer to the question of whether the project is worthwhile doing. The problem perhaps with cost-benefit analysis in the health sector is how do we explicitly perhaps place a value on life. And as you can see, again, this slide is taken from the McKeon Review, and it provides various estimates for an extra year of life. Interestingly, there's a fairly wide range depending on how you estimate the different techniques to estimate the value of life. As you can see here, on the left-hand side, you have the human capital approach, which effectively values life using people's actual sort of wages and earnings. Economists have tended to move away from that because they regard, obviously, life has a value, an intrinsic value, and it's not just related to people's sort of productive outputs. But then there's a variety of techniques, either what people might say is reveal preference techniques, which are things like looking at how people value their own life in their purchase of safety equipment, or you can look at asking people through willingness to pay techniques, or look at some occupations where people face higher risks, such as in the mining industry, but they also get compensated through higher wages. Each of these provide a way of getting an estimate for the cost of a change in risk or an increase in life expectancy. So just to take one perhaps practical example, there are relatively few examples of cost-benefit analysis, although there have been a considerable amount of work to try and value health outcomes in monetary terms. Here's an Australian example where I looked at the valuing access to mammographic screening units, which provide breast cancer screening in rural areas of Australia. And what we did in this study was used travel costs to try and estimate the value women placed at different distances from existing screening sites. It's one of the relatively few examples of cost-benefit analysis to evaluate a healthcare program in Australia and indeed even internationally. So as you can see from this next diagram, what we've got here is we've basically got the distance of different towns. As you can see, the towns, as we go down here, are further and further away from an existing site, an existing fixed site, and we've basically got estimates of what the proportion of women who would have attended if they had to travel to the fixed unit. So if they're only 15 kilometres away, they basically have around about a 37% chance of attending that breast cancer screening site. If they're 160 kilometres away, they have about a 20% chance. If you introduce mobile units, basically the probability of the women attending increases, and as you can see, that's indicated in this column here. From that, we can estimate what's called a compensating variation or a willingness to pay, and these estimates are here, and they range from around about $1.50 to around about $50. And I must stress this analysis was done 20 years ago, so these would have to be updated today. And perhaps the last column, which is perhaps the important one, is giving you a ratio of the cost to benefits. And what's kind of interesting here is it shows that under 50 kilometres, the towns that were under 50 kilometres, basically the costs outweigh the benefits, and over 50 kilometres the benefits outweigh the costs. So what you could say, if you were interpreting this cost-benefit analysis, is that you should be using mobile screening units in towns that are more than 50 kilometres away. But I must stress this analysis is quite an old one, and you would want to redo that using contemporary data if you were going to implement a rule like this in practice. So back to our flow diagram. As you can see, we're now down to the final box down here. And so the question then we want to ask is, can the outcomes be measured as quality adjusted life years? If the answer is no, what we need to use is cost effectiveness analysis. And if the answer is yes, we will use cost utility analysis. So starting first with cost effectiveness analysis, what it does is it's a method that it's probably the most commonly used method in health economic evaluation. It compares costs and outcomes. What it requires is a common, unambiguous outcome measure. That could be any sort of natural unit. It could be something like cases detected when it comes to something like cancer screening. It could be deaths prevented. But often economists like using a metric such as life years gained because it allows us to compare across many different types of interventions. So to take an example of cost effectiveness analysis, here's an example from a study called the Advanced study. What it involved was the use of a fixed combination of two types of blood pressure drugs in people with diabetes. What you've got to do is work out the costs and cost effectiveness of the intervention costs. And in this case, over a 4-year period, these drugs at that time cost around about $1,350. But then one has to look at whether the intervention can potentially reduce healthcare costs over time through reducing morbidity, and in this case through reducing the risk of complications of diabetes. And here we observed around about $800 in savings or cost offsets. So although the drugs cost $1,350, the people who were given the drugs on average cost around $800 less over that 4-year period. So the net cost or net incremental cost was around about $500. And the trial showed a significant difference in mortality, and extrapolating that to life expectancy, there was a significant increase in life years gained for the intervention group given the blood pressure drugs. So if we try to illustrate those outcomes, we can use what's commonly referred to as a cost effectiveness plane. On the x-axis of the cost effectiveness plane, what we have is the effects in terms of the change in life years gained of the intervention versus the control. So C is the control, which in this case were the people who weren't given the intervention, were given a placebo. So what we obviously have is the incremental cost is the 0.05 life years gained, and so that's the increase in outcomes of the intervention over control. On the y-axis up here, we basically have the increase. Up here is the incremental increase in costs of the intervention over control. Now, what the plane basically maps out is 4 separate quadrants. So perhaps if we start with the northwest quadrant, that would be an intervention that is more costly and less effective. And I think in that case, most people would agree you wouldn't adopt the intervention because there's no point in spending more money and getting less outcomes. So in that case, we would say the existing treatment, which in this case is no treatment, would be the preferred treatment. One also then might come down to the southwest quadrant, where you get a new treatment that is less costly but less effective. Now, clearly, there are countries and health systems where you're making those sorts of decisions, where basically you're disinvesting in health technologies, you're getting less health outcomes, but you're saving money. But that's often not where that's not a quadrant where many governments work. It's really when you've got very severe difficulties in your healthcare system and affordability in your healthcare system. So basically, one can make trade-offs, but that's not normally the region a country like Australia is making trade-offs. So then if we come over to the southeast quadrant, what we've got here is we've got an increase in effects and a decrease in costs. And in that case, you're in the ideal situation where the new treatment should be adopted or the new treatment dominates because you've got no trade-offs here, you get better outcomes and it's less costly. Having said that, that's the exception rather than the rule. In most cases, most interventions take place in this northeast quadrant, where basically we're getting an increase, where you have to spend more money, but we get an increase in the the associated health outcomes. And as you can see, this point here is the point that defines our two blood pressure drugs. And the slope of that line gives you the cost per life year, which in this case is around $10,000 per life year gained. And in a country like Australia, that would be considered a very cost-effective intervention. So the final type of analysis we'll consider is cost-utility analysis. And this is when you can measure outcomes in quality-adjusted life years. What are quality-adjusted life years? Well, it's best illustrated by this diagram here. And what we've got is basically on the vertical axis, we've got a quality of life scale. And on the horizontal axis, we've got durations of time. And as you can see here, what we can do is map out a potential profile of quality of life over time for somebody who doesn't receive an intervention, and then compare that with a profile with somebody who does receive an intervention. As you can see, we've got many ways we could potentially compare these two profiles. We could, for example, look at time to what we might call first event, which is the first event that impacts on their quality of life. And as you can see here, those without the intervention, there's an event that occurs that decreases their quality of life much earlier on than those people who receive the intervention. We could also go back and look at life expectancy, which we've looked at in the cost effectiveness analysis. But again, what we're missing here is what all is the impacts on quality of life before they get towards their end of their life. So we could also count the number of events. So here, without the intervention, we have 4 events that impact on your quality of life. Here we only have 3 with the health profile. But I think what we would like to do is weight each of the events and their impact on quality of life on this quality of life scale, where 1 is a state equivalent to full health and 0 is a state equivalent to death. And clearly what we're trying to do is measure intermediate states on this scale, which is often called a QALY. And what we get here then potentially is if we measure the area between these two profiles, we can call this the quality adjusted life years gained. So to give you a final example, this slide is taken from a recent large trial called the IDEAL study, which was looking at early versus late initiation of dialysis. This figure is taken from a publication by Harris et al. And as you can see, what it includes is the standard cost effectiveness plane. But importantly here, where we are on the plane, and that would be the late use of dialysis, and this is the early in comparison. And what we can see is that we're up in the northwest quadrant, which is the quadrant where the existing treatment dominates. So basically, the issue with early intervention in dialysis, it was both more costly and produced less quality adjusted life years. So what we would say in this case is that the late treatment dominates. So here's an example of quantifying the outcomes in QALYs where you would want to stick with perhaps the existing analyses. So that ends our lecture. This is one part or one module of a full Introduction to Health Economics course we run at the University of Melbourne. And to provide you a very brief overview of the day, Module 1 is the lecture I have just given you over the last 40 minutes. But then we move to Module 2 of identifying, measuring and valuing and analysing costs, which are clearly an important part of economic evaluation. Module 3 looks at outcome measurement. Module 4 looks at policy use and interpretation of cost effectiveness analysis. And we conclude by looking at a paper that looks at a cost effectiveness analysis and tries to identify all the elements from the previous modules and allows you to interpret that paper. so that in the course of the day you can perhaps go from having no knowledge of economics to being able to understand and read a health economics paper. If you're interested in attending this course, please look at details on our website. Thank you for sitting through our introductory lecture. As I indicated at the beginning of the lecture, it forms part of our one-day Introduction to Health Economic Evaluation course. You may also be interested in other courses we offer which are pitched at a more advanced level, such as our 3-day Practical Methods of Economic Evaluation course, which is designed to give people the skills and experience to undertake economic evaluations for themselves.